Good afternoon. My name is Ricardo Valerdi, and I'm a professor in the Department of Systems and Industrial Engineering and faculty athletics representative here at the U of A. Behind me, we have President Bobby Robbins, Dave Hickey, Rick George, Jamie Miettinen, Andy Schwartz, Don McPherson, MADDIE Salamone, and Greg Clifton. You'll hear a little bit more about them in just one moment. I want to begin by thanking the Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Title IX and the Sports Management Program at Eller for partnering with us in this event. Like every organization, we must evolve, and college athletics is at that tipping point. We're entering a new era where the topic of name, image, and likeness is getting a lot of press and a lot of visibility. It's an exciting time, but it comes also with a lot of uncertainty. We just don't know where things are going to end up. For the student athletes here then, what is NIL? NIL is the ability for you or someone to profit based on your name, like in a video game, an autograph, an advertisement, some sort of sponsorship, your image, your likeness, your avatar, social media, a shoe company, jersey, any of that for money. Broadly speaking, NIL is about the relationship between student athletes, their education, and the monetary value they generate for both the athletics department and outside entities. The fact that Alabama's Tua Tagovailoa has 500,000 followers on Instagram has to be worth something to somebody. For our 500 student athletes here at the University of Arizona and the 500,000 around the country, we are committed to the college model of athletics. But what does that mean? The concept of amateurism is what's changing before our eyes. This is one of the many topics you'll hear this panel address today. The amount of benefits that student athletes receive has grown significantly over the past 10 years. Think about the $3.5 billion in scholarships annually, the degree completion programs, the enhanced nutrition and wellness, expanded medical coverage, academic support, career counseling services, and much, much more. But now the NCAA agrees that change is appropriate, necessary, and in the best interests of student athletes. But the question remains, how do we design a process, a system that is fair, manageable, does not constitute compensation for athletics performance or participation, and maintains a clear difference between college and professional sports? To say that this is a complex issue is an understatement. There are many, many moving parts. And there's even ongoing litigation on this matter for which the Pac-12 and the NCAA are parties to. So we'll try to stay away from some of that. But think of the landmark cases: O'Bannon versus NCAA, Jenkins versus NCAA, Alston versus NCAA. One of the epicenters in all this discussion is Oakland, California, Federal Court, 9th District, where Judge Claudia Wilkin has ruled on some of these cases. The 9th District covers Arizona. But here in Tucson, today, this panel is all about having an intellectual dialogue among experts. Don't expect to get answers to everything today, but do expect to have a lively discussion. So today, I'm proud to be a faculty member at the University of Arizona because we have this open dialogue. And our leaders, Dave Hickey and Bobby Robbins, are at the front of that. So with that, I want to introduce University of Arizona President Bobby Robbins.
Thank you, Ricardo. I don't know if you mentioned you're our faculty athletic representative, and you came to me with this idea only a few weeks ago, and they said it couldn't be done. So I have to thank AZPM, presidential event staff for making this happen so quickly, but mostly thanks to our panelists who, on very, very short notice, many of whom, I think I see 3 of you who had to brave snow, and I don't know how in the world you got a flight on Sunday after the holiday to get out of New York City or Detroit to get here, but we are so appreciative of you being here, and we look forward to a spirited exchange of ideas and hearing from the experts. I'm certainly not an expert, so I just look forward to hearing your comments, and I think I'll turn it over to Dave and let him begin. So the format will be, Dave will introduce the first 3 speakers, and they'll have about 5 minutes or so, and then after that, there'll be Dave and I'll pose questions. We did have a chance. We tried to get Coach O'Bannon, Ed, and Ricardo and I spoke with him on the phone, and he was very humbled to be asked to participate in this panel. And as I was talking to him and thinking about it, he's sort of the Curt Flood of free agency for Major League Baseball back in the day. Because no matter which way this goes, and I agree with Ricardo, it's moving very rapidly and we're going to see a lot of change. So we'll have some fun with that today, and we just appreciate all the people here on campus who showed up on short notice, but all of you who are watching via live stream. So Dave?
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Robbins. And again, welcome everyone here to the University of Arizona. We're excited to have our panel with us and really dive into the discussion. And there's a lot of it, as you've heard, it's been well set up. So I'm going to introduce our first panelist, a colleague, a friend, Rick George. Rick is the athletic director currently at the University of Colorado. Was a former student athlete at the University of Illinois. Has served in the sports world in Major League Baseball with the Texas Rangers, the PGA Golf Tour, and is also sitting on the committee. The NCAA committee addressing name, image, and likeness. So we're glad to have Rick here. And Rick, why don't you open the floor for us here?
Great, I'll do that. Thank you, and thanks for having me today, and appreciate all of you coming out to listen to this panel about the name, image, and likeness. As a former Division I collegiate football player at the University of Illinois, I've recruited in the game, I've coached in the game, I've administered at the professional level and the college level. I believe in the collegiate model. I believe it provides many benefits for our student athletes. When I studied and played at the University of Illinois, we had very few of the benefits that student athletes have today. I won't go into what we didn't have, it was a lot. Rather, I will discuss some of the reforms that have happened over the last several years to the benefit of our student athletes. Today's schools guarantee scholarships regardless of athletic performance or injury. Schools provide financial aid and cover expenses for academic support, career development, and cultural experiences. Schools provide state-of-the-art technology, tutoring, and access to academic advisors. In fact, due to academic reforms, more than 17,000 former college athletes in Division I have returned to campus to complete their degrees since 2004, many funded by the schools. Starting this spring, a portion of Division I revenue will be distributed to member schools based on the academic achievement of the student athletes. Schools are now offering full cost of attendance that is not covered by the scholarship. Schools now provide unlimited meals with multiple nutritionists, sports dietitians. Schools now have and provide state-of-the-art strength and conditioning programs, world-class training, masseuses, chiropractors, doctors. The NCAA funds an insurance policy covering all college athletes who experience catastrophic injury while playing and practicing their sport. Many schools also provide medical coverage for athletically related injuries for at least 2 years after a student athlete graduates. There are many other things that schools provide, but relative to NIL, it's important, and it's a natural extension of the benefits and opportunities that we provide our student athletes. This past May, as you know, the NCAA Board of Governors announced a creation of a working group to look into the name, image, and likeness. I'm fortunate that I've been able to serve on that committee. We were charged with examining possible changes in NCAA bylaws that are tethered to education, maintain a clear line of demarcation between professional and collegiate sports, and further align student athletes with the general student body. The NCAA Board of Governors approved our recommendations unanimously. As I said earlier, the modernization for the future relative to name, image, and likeness is a natural extension of the numerous steps we have taken to benefit our student athletes. Benefits for name, image, and likeness should not be a substitute form of currency to pay for athletics performance. Regulation of a student athlete's name, image, and likeness use should be transparent, focused, enforceable, and should promote the integrity of the recruiting process, and a student athlete should be able to benefit from his or her name, image, and likeness similar to college students who are not student athletes, while recognizing the importance of interstate uniform competition and recruiting rules that are unique to NCAA athletics. Finally, this isn't going to be a quick process, and we're not going to make everybody happy when the final legislation comes forth, whenever that is. But I can tell you that this is an important area. It's the next step for our student athletes. We take it very seriously, and we're going to work very hard to provide the very best we can with a name, image, and likeness for our student athletes. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rick, and look forward to kind of unbundling a little bit of that too as we continue to talk this afternoon. So, our second panelist is an attorney specializing in sports law, a graduate of Tulane Law. She worked in the sports and the legal industry, focusing on sports and entertainment law. Currently operates her own law firm, and she's a specialist in sports law, an accomplished legal writer and blogger. So please welcome Jamie Mittenham. Jamie, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming. Like Dave said, I'm an attorney, and one of my primary client bases are student athletes, or how I like to refer to them. I assist them through NCAA procedures, and I coach them through various arguments in their favor. And as I've been working through this, one thing has become obvious to me. Many of these college athletes don't fully understand or know the extent of control that the NCAA and its member institutions exert over their lives once they become a student athlete. When they agree to provide their student athlete player services to the school, there is what I would call quite a bit of exploitation going on. Sometimes it's before they sign their national letter of intent, or for those who don't sign an NLI, walk on, so they're not bound, they are not getting any sort of athletic financial scholarships. Sometimes it's in the beginning or the middle stages of a matter, and sometimes it's almost too late, all because a 400-plus page manual from one business says so. When drafting rules and bylaws and contracts and laws and just arguments in general, word choice is really important. We may define words differently or attach varying connotations to them. For example, it's reasonable to believe that you and I may have a different definition of what amateurism could be, and all of us here on this panel probably have slightly different variations as well. Another one of those words is competitive balance. How do we frame competitive balance and what it means? And that largely depends on what market you look at. And with the way that the collegiate model acts now, we have a lot of different markets we can be looking at. And with NIL rights in particular, we have to really frame it properly. In business law in general, there's a relatively intimidating area called antitrust law, where it flat out says every contract, combination, or conspiracy in restraint of trade is illegal. And now we all know that doesn't actually happen in the real world. We accept that some of these things are bound to happen and are necessary to happen in order for something to function. So what we look at then is the reasonableness of that contract. Some things are not reasonable per se, what we call in law. One of those things is price fixing. Latching on where horizontally a cartel, that is another word that's really important to define too. How do we define a cartel? It's not like a drug cartel, but it's something where a group of people agree to restrict something in order for their benefit. And here, that horizontal agreement is naturally prone to be unfavorable. But in sports, we do need some sort of agreement along those lines, and so then we have to look at the reasonableness of it. And in going through that, we look at a lot of different factors. And then once we look at those factors, we have to define the pro-competitive benefits, compare them to any anti-competitive effects, and then find out whether these are pro-net competitive. And if they are not pro-net competitive, then it's ruled unlawful. But if they are, then we have to look to see whether there are any less restrictive alternatives. And with this NIL rights issue, I believe that there are less restrictive alternatives. Courts have even said there are less restrictive alternatives. So we may not want to initially acknowledge that these inequities and market inefficiencies exist because we're afraid that everything will go away. And that doesn't really mean that we need to accept it as is. So what if we modify the lens that we viewed amateurism? It's been changing for decades as is. Maybe now is a time that we have to change it a little bit in order to fit the modern market and society that we all really play a role in. Words are important, so I think that we all need to make sure we're on the same page, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
All right, well, thanks, Jamie, appreciate that. And you kind of threw some terms out there and some words for people to begin to kind of center around. And again, I know that that's going to open a lot of doors for people to walk down, so thanks for doing that. And speaking of that, our third panelist is a prominent economist with a sports focus, particularly on the topics of the NCAA, Title IX, NIL, and competitive balance. He's been consulted on significant cases like the Raiders versus the NFL, White versus the NCAA, the O'Bannon case. So please welcome Andy Schwartz to the panel.
Thank you.
Andy?
So I am an antitrust economist, and I use words like cartel too, and I use them in the sense of firms that agree amongst themselves to set prices or pay or non-pay that's in the form of a scholarship. And as an antitrust economist, I've been studying collusively enforced amateurism for 20 years. As mentioned, my clients have included Ed O'Bannon, Sean Alston, Martin Jenkins, and I work with Senator Nancy Skinner to sponsor California's SB 206. Now, as part of my work for athletes' rights, I've co-founded the HBL. We're a professional college sports league because my conclusion is that the only way to truly fix college sports is by building the enterprise on the foundation of athletes' rights, rather than, quote unquote, reforming a system that treats those rights as privileges. In contrast to the amateurism cartel, where restricting economic rights are the core ethos, that's what amateurism is, the HBL's premise is that the business model should adapt to athletes' rights, not vice versa. And not just economic rights, excuse me, all rights matter. Some schools compromise safety. They're slow to take action against a bad apple authority figure or an athlete who engages in, say, sexual misconduct or other forms of abuse, because that would risk revenue and prestige. Schools sometimes compromise their educational mission in pursuit of sports excellence, admitting students unprepared for the rigor of a top-tier university, but then when they're admitted, they must make immediate progress towards a degree to remain eligible, so you end up with massive amounts of tutoring, a paper class or two, and pretty soon attending school and no longer correlates with getting an education. If you're fully ready to take advantage of educational opportunities, whole swaths of majors can be off limits, especially STEM majors, because they need to major in something that fits their practice and travel schedules. And I think the result is doubly exploitative. First, the exact definition in economics of exploitation is earning less than your non-collusive market value. It has nothing to do with whether you get a lot of benefits, it's are you getting your full. Section itself is exploitative when students are denied a healthy, safe environment to learn at their own level in the major of their choosing, and instead are asked to squeeze school in between road games. You'll hear power brokers like the Pac-12's Larry Scott offering a false choice: earn your full worth or go to college. In contrast, in my organization, the HBL, athletes will be paid professionals who are also able to earn and do earn guaranteed 5-year scholarships. Our summer schedule allows them to major in anything they want and to attend every class. Our athletes won't be admitted contrary to the judgment of the school's admissions professionals. Instead, our educational foundation will identify schools where our employee athletes are ready to thrive academically, whether it's a 4-year, 2-year, vocational, or online program. As we talk today, to Jamie's point, I'd ask you to think about the words that we use, because I think that they speak to whether the panelists treat athletes as full citizens or perhaps something a little less. Which of us use adult verbs like earn, and who falls back onto more of a noblesse oblige, words like give or provide, benefits, charity? Who insists on using the term student athlete when that term was specifically designed to deny athletes their workers' compensation rights? Who prioritizes a school's preference for, say, golf scholarships over a basketball athlete's right to earn his or her full value? Are women's rights being used as an excuse to deny men their rights? Who's focused on helping athletes win back their rights, and who's more concerned about whether their school will win their fair share of games? Each panelist's view on NIL itself will be illuminating, but I'll let you know what mine is. Athletes fully own their individual NIL rights, period. In the HBL, we would only intervene in an athlete's NIL deal if we thought somehow he was being paid too little. But I think you'll hear terms like guardrails here, designed to make sure that somehow athletes aren't being paid too much. That isn't a standard we use for coaches. It shouldn't be a standard we use for athletes. Ricardo at the beginning about this proved my point already, which is that schools often fret about how complex this problem is. But I think oftentimes that complexity can be a smokescreen for delay. The people who think it's complex, I would ask them, have you gone to professionals on your campus? You've got lawyers, you've got economists, you've got people in the business school, all of whom who solve these problems in every other walk of life every day. Have you asked them how to solve it? Have you written a letter to the Department of Education asking them to clarify how Title IX works? I don't think a just, equitable solution, except that it may mean that some people who benefit from the current injustice have to get less, and I don't think that's really a problem. So I look forward to talking about all these ideas, and I thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay. That was a lot.
Squeeze it in.
Yeah, so we need to, we'll keep going on here because but you know, of course we want to jump right in and start getting on a couple of things you were talking about there, but we'll get them later. Our next panelist is legendary Syracuse and NFL star Don McPherson, who played quarterback at the highest level in the league, and is there's a lot going on at Syracuse right now, and that's a whole nother topic we could talk about. Home of Jim Brown and Floyd Little and Donovan McNabb and Don McPherson, and it's still going on. So we can, if we run out of topics, we can come back to that. But Don has been here to the University of Arizona a couple of times before, and he's a prominent author, and I actually went and got, luckily, there were still copies left of your book, and maybe each of you have a copy, but I'm going to give that as part of your gift for coming through the snow, Rick, to get down here to be on this panel. The book's entitled "You Throw Like a Girl," and focuses on the blind spots of masculinity. So there's so much we can talk about, Don, but why don't you try to, we won't use the word guardrail, but stay focused on this topic because we got so much we could talk to you about.
Thank you. And I don't think we're going to run out of things to talk about.
don't either.
What was interesting is just listening to everyone talk, going back to Ricardo, is I tended to agree and disagree with what everyone said. And I think some of the people probably had the same feeling, that I agree with that. I don't like the terminology that gets used. And I think sometimes it does feel like a cartel. And I think that is rooted in what I believe, and it's not just a belief, there's no other country in the world that has attached athletics to higher education like we have. And we have taken what has been the only industry, save for technology in the 90s, that has had the kind of growth and expansion that's linked to a very emotional place. It's linked to our love for our alma mater, our loyalty to our city. It's linked to this very emotional place that we all sit, and it drives a multi-billion-dollar industry. And athletics was never meant to be a multi-billion-dollar industry within the structure of higher education. And you have to go back to the founding of the NCAA, to Teddy Roosevelt, who wanted to ban football, and Teddy Roosevelt saved football because higher ed was saying, this doesn't belong on our campus. And so ever since then, we have been trying to shove a square peg into a round hole. That doesn't fit. That's the complexity. The complexity of Division I, II, and III, the complexity of state school, private school, the complexity of an expanding landscape of college sports that has grown more grotesque with each year. And we talked the other day about, about this conversation, about we're talking about what we have ignored in higher education, this expanding business, and we've decided not to incorporate. When we talk about the business, we talk about it as if it's extraneous to the experience of a student athlete. They are a part and parcel of a multi-billion-dollar industry, and yet we act like they're not. And now because we're being forced, in higher education by legislators and people from outside of the academy, we're being forced to address the issue, and now we're forcing our student athletes in this conversation to a third market, when we should be showing them the value, Rick, of everything that you laid out. My scholarship in today's dollars at Syracuse University is probably close, all in, everything you cited, is probably more than $300,000 a year. And most student athletes don't know that. So they don't appreciate the monetary nor intrinsic value of their experience. That's a failure of the academy, to show them that they are part of a multi-billion-dollar industry that we value their participation in. But instead of doing that, instead of seeing this, and I do believe that many people in the academy have taken their hands off of this wheel and have left it to legislators, and have left it to attorneys to figure out how do we talk about these issues, instead of the solutions coming from within the academy. If this is not tethered to education, throw it out. Throw it out, because you have stadiums in this, and by the way, I am a college football junkie. I'm on the board of the New York City chapter of the National Football Foundation. I love my game. But we would not be having this conversation if it were not for 100,000-seat stadiums and the NCAA tournament, which some people don't understand, that NCAA doesn't control those 100,000-seat stadiums on Saturday afternoons. That's the Power Five. And this complexity of this, we would not be having this conversation if it weren't for those programs where coaches are making millions and millions of dollars, where there are billions of dollars being traded amongst and around student athletes, and very often student athletes who are not qualified to attend those institutions. That's a problem. And so we haven't made good on that promise. And we're here, and I mean no disrespect to Olympic sports in any regard, but we are here because of what feels like the exploitation of student athletes at the highest level. But they are receiving an opportunity, as did I, that is invaluable. And when I first met our new chancellor at Syracuse a couple of years ago, he said, Don, this institution means so much to us. And that we are indebted to all that you've been as an ambassador, as an educator, as all the things you've done. And there is no way Syracuse University will ever get as much out of me as I will out of Syracuse University. But part of what we have not taken ownership of is that there is a sense that the student athletes who drive this business, who are the ones who we feel we're indebted to because they were great ambassadors or because they're making the money and they're setting the market and all those things, we've already assumed that they can't do college work. So we're saying pay them. Pay them, let them go into a third market where they can market themselves and make a few extra bucks on the side, and that's going to get into a slippery slope of what I call recruiting malpractice, where kids are going to be promised all these other opportunities to make money. But it's rooted in the fact that we don't think that they can be students. So just pay them. And to me, I look at student athletes who are at the very high level in football and basketball who are desperate for education, desperate for reform in that regard. And I feel like what we're doing now with this conversation around whether it's cost of attendance or now NIL, it's like a child who needs attention from a parent, instead the parent saying, here's $5, go to the mall. When what that child really needs is attention. And so add this to the complexity of the problem, that there are so many young people who are not getting the first promise. And I don't know any coach who ever promised anything more than the opportunity to get an education and to compete. Make do on the first promise to get an education. I will say this one last thing. On the back cover of my book is a picture of me in a football uniform playing against Rutgers. I think we won the game. And there was a guy chasing me too. But I chose the picture of me in a Syracuse University uniform. I'm 54 years old. That was 30 years ago. I still trade on that mark. It still has value. I choose that. And by the way, I choose that without a feeling that I was exploited by my institution. It's what I said to my chancellor. I choose that because that's part of me leveraging my education and my experience to grow my business, to grow my work. Not when I'm there as a student athlete and that's my shelf life. But when I'm 54 and I still say that my education and my experience at Syracuse University matters today. And if we don't have student athletes who can say that, then we failed.
Wow. Okay.
I'm done.
You started going.
I just had my own notes here.
Yeah, from preaching to meddling there. Don't start meddling, right? All right, so this could be an hour-long one-on-one interview with each of you. So we'll try to keep the cats herded. You know, that's the job around here. We got a bunch of wildcats. So love this panel. So our next panelist is MADDIE SALAMONE, who is a practicing attorney in the Southern District of Manhattan, but just not with the U.S. Attorney's Office. She's has her own private practice, and her work is focused on advocacy for athletes. And MADDIE was a former Duke lacrosse player and was the chair of the D1 Student Athlete Advisory Committee. So, MADDIE, thank you for making the trek all the way from New York City to
Thank you. Good to be
Tucson.
here among other New Yorkers. So I want to start by saying, while I think that this is a very important issue in college athletics, I actually don't think this is the most important issue. I think the abuse and mistreatment of athletes is actually something that really needs college athletics. But we're here to talk about name, image, and likeness, so I'm going to focus on that. I do see these issues as being linked by an overall attitude within the NCAA that, you know, schools and the NCAA are doing such a great job of, you know, giving athletes so many things that they should be grateful for, and that they should really just sit down and do what they're told. And that, combined with a certain level of arrogance on the part of many coaches, administrators, and NCAA staff, makes for a very interesting environment. And, you know, I'm certainly not talking about everyone in college sports. I think there are many people within athletics that are, you know, very thoughtful leaders, and I think part of the reason why we're here having this discussion is that we're trying to figure out what's in the best interest of college athletes. That said, you know, we're working within a system that's broken. And I can say that as someone who really sat in rooms behind the doors of the NCAA, listened to many discussions about many of the things that we're talking about today. And this is going back to 2011. We were having discussions about name, image, and likeness. At the time, that was an absolute no-starter. Now we're talking about it like, oh, well, obviously we're going to give rights to athletes. That was not something that was even a possibility. It was going to ruin college sports as we knew it at the time. Of course, now, fast forward, you know, a few years later, and suddenly, by law, you know, it seems inevitable that we're going to have those rights. So, you know, my experiences chairing the committee, where I was dedicated to soliciting feedback from athletes across the country and advocating on their behalves, as well as experiences within various councils within the NCAA and the Rules Working Group, which, you know, at the time was supposed to completely revamp the entire rule book. And again, we would get to issues that would be discussed as, you know, not being that important to what, you know, athletics was really about. And at the end of the day, decisions couldn't be made. So we were left with this massive rule book of rules that didn't make any sense anymore. And things that, you know, while waivers may be granted, still required waivers to be granted. Now, the use of name, image, and likeness, it's not about paying athletes. And I think, you know, a lot of times, you know, we go back to this competitive balance argument for so many of the rules. But it's about allowing athletes to make full use of their bodies of work and their platform as athletes, a platform which they reached through their own hard work long before college. And, you know, to address something about the using your, you know, body of work after you graduate, that's all well and good, but the truth of the matter is that a lot of the individual, especially women and non-revenue sports, where they don't have an opportunity to go professional after college, college is their platform. And that's a time when they can really, you know, profit off of some of the things that they do. And it's not just limited to sports. They can use it to grow their own brand, create opportunities for their future, you know, which the current rules substantially limit. There are increasing opportunities in social media, from being an influencer to creating a YouTube channel to marketing personal merchandise to being a spokesperson for a brand, and that can be related or unrelated to athletics, and the list goes on and on. There's a great value in the expertise that athletes have developed as students of their sports, as leaders in their communities, and as individuals with interests that extend far beyond sports. Those skills and talents are worth a lot of money, even if only to parents of young athletes looking for coaching and mentoring. I knew athletes who were talented musicians, models, producers, etc., and their sport actually got in the way of some, you know, of those pursuits more often than the other way around. At the same time, there's a great deal of fear-mongering within the NCAA in the form of misinformations and warnings of what could happen if we stop taking rights away from athletes when they enter college, and really even before they ever enter college, because prospective college athletes are held to the same rules before they're even recruited. And one scare tactic that really bothers me as a female is that this notion that allowing athletes to have the same name, image, and likeness rights as every other student on campus would be unfair to female athletes and lead to the certain decimation of women's sports and non-revenue sports altogether. And I can't tell you the number of times that I feel like someone has wanted to remove my, you know, female card because they can't understand why I could support all athletes having more rights when, according to them, it will hurt women. And that not only falsely assumes that female athletes have no value to potential sponsors or as social media influencers, or even that they have creative or entrepreneurial potential, but it begins with the false premise that male and female athletes are treated equally now. And they're not. So let me correct that false narrative. Not only is per player spending currently higher for male athletes at schools in the form of uniforms, equipment, facilities, marketing, coaching staff, budget, training table, etc., all of which are technically in violation of Title IX, though it's not really enforced. But it's ridiculous to act like denying NIL rights in any way helps women of any sport, color, or socioeconomic background. This limits women's abilities to profit off of their body of work and creativity as much as it does men. And even in circumstances where female athletes may not have the same national profile as some of their male colleagues, they certainly have recognition in their hometowns, and that's worth a lot of money too, even if they choose to only use it to run a camp over break without having to first seek a waiver from the NCAA. And also, dare I say that I think, you know, women being on a platform and being able to use their names, images, and likeness to promote their own sport could actually create additional opportunities to grow fan bases and more media opportunities for women, which are significantly lacking. I mean, check the coverage of women's sports now. They're barely in the ticker tape, let alone, you know, being broadcast in games. And another concern is that athletes will be exploited by people trying to make a profit. But the reality is that athletes are already in plenty of situations where they're being handed wads of cash after a game, or where people offer to help their families, which are all violations of NCAA rules. And more people need to understand that most athletes are not on full scholarships. And not only are they not on full scholarships, but of the ones that are, who also receive Pell Grants, many of those are sending home money to their families who may struggle to have enough food to feed their brothers and sisters, and who are living in poverty. Some are even sending home, money to their own children while their coaches are making millions of dollars and plus bonuses, and schools are buying out contracts of coaches they decide to fire without consideration of what that will do to the athletes that came in under them. Allowing athletes to make full use of their names, images, and likenesses will serve to restore fairness to the system and allow athletes to start saving for their futures.
All right. Keep raising the bar here. So, Greg, you're our last panelist. Greg Clifton is an attorney who had to drive down from Phoenix, but thank you. That drive is...
Flew in from Boston yesterday.
There you go. I knew you all came from snow, except for Andy, I think. The last time I looked, it wasn't snowing in the Bay, although it snowed in Tahoe.
We had frost on Thanksgiving morning.
Yeah, well, it's tough of a deal to live in the East Bay. So Greg is an attorney who focuses on professional franchises, on general labor and employment. He was an executive at Gaylord Sports Management. Interestingly, coming off of Maddie's comments, was Jenny Finch's agent.
Yes, I was.
I think Jenny Finch could have made a little money when she was
A lot of money.
at the U of A. He speaks on sports law, agent regulation, and salary arbitration. So thanks for coming in from Boston. Hopefully you get to drive home to Phoenix tonight.
Yes, I will. Thank you so much for having me. I thought it might make some sense. This panel was supposed to be more about name, image, and likeness. We've heard a lot of passionate comments from our panelists about issues that might be related to name, image, and likeness. But for a lot of people in the audience, you might not be up to speed on what's really happening with name, image, and likeness. And as one of the panelists mentioned, California is the first state now that actually has passed a law which will become effective on July 1st of 2023, which is the extreme of name, image, and likeness rights. It provides an absolute opportunity for all student athletes to maximize their value. Basically, the only restriction would be, which was an amendment to the bill, which would restrict the student athlete based upon if there's a conflict with the specific schools, any agreements or marketing agreements they might have already in place. So the best example I can give of that, if a school is a Nike school, a student athlete would not be able to engage and have a contract with Under Armour and subvert the value of that opportunity that the school has with that initial contract. Subsequent to the California law, we've seen a whole myriad of bills, as I call it. It's the legislator, how I can look good bill process. Every single legislature around the country has one legislator or two who's jumping in front of this issue. And I was just in New York a couple weeks ago where the New York bill has been introduced, and the New York bill was really interesting, which the legislator who introduced it I don't really think understands the ramifications. His provisions require a 15% revenue sharing of all ticket revenue that each school in the state of New York generates on the school basis, and at the end of each school year, that 15% revenue must be equally distributed between all student athletes, male, female, star quarterback, or the fourth person sitting in the crew boat. They each get an equal share of that 15%. And I just mentioned this not to criticize him, but I think just to show how legislators have jumped on the bandwagon here. When I was serving as a moderator of that panel, I asked him if any of the people who helped him draft that legislation were concerned or were aware potentially of the fact that if you distribute 15% of your revenue from tickets back to the student athletes, you might be making every one of those student athletes, in fact, employees of the university. And he kind of looked at me and I said, that means NLRA or NLRB rights, it means EEOC rights, it means workers' compensation rights, it means also probably helping these student athletes understand the tax ramifications of receiving this revenue. And he looked at me and he said, well, and he thought for about a minute, it seemed like about 5 minutes, and he said, well, what we'll do is we'll just put some language in the bill that says any student athletes cannot become employees of the university. That was his solution. And I said, well, that might make sense in the state of New York, but I don't know if the feds are going to really appreciate that when the IRS or any other federal agencies want to come seeking some tax revenue from your student athletes. I mentioned that as an extreme because you have the California on one level and you have the state of New York, and there's a bunch, I believe there's either 27 or 28 states now that have either introduced legislation or are going to be introducing legislation with the new legislative session that either begins in January or February in most of these states. So there's a wide variety of rumors of what's going to take place. The interesting one right now is Florida. Florida is claiming that their legislation, which already has bipartisan support as well as the governor's support indicating he will sign it as soon as it's presented to him, is supposed to start July 1 of 2020. So that's going to be coming very quickly. So what does all that mean for all of us here and all the student athletes? It means we're going to have a lot of lawsuits, and there's going to be a lot of lawyers who are going to be very happy with all the lawsuits that are going to be flying back and forth, because that's what's going to happen. Because right now, a lot of things seem to be in line, but all of a sudden, you're going to have a myriad of issues, and I'll just throw one out for you. If you have a student athlete who has the right to maximize their name, image, and likeness with an unlimited, the California bill, that does not guarantee that student athlete to use and have the right to use the trademark of the university that he's now going to be seeking, or she's going to be seeking, to maximize name, image, and likeness rights from. So I just had a phone call earlier today, in fact, from a trading card company asking me for some explanation about name, image, and likeness. And he said, that's right, I had no idea. I'm going to probably have to go get a license from the university or the colleges to get a right to use those trademarks. Then I'm going to have to try and sign up the individual student athletes, because student athletes are not unionized. And despite the NFLPA volunteering, the nice people that they are volunteering to assist student athletes, I'm sure to realize there's a lot of money to be made off of student athletes. Student athletes, as happened back with the Northwestern case from a few years ago, are not unionized. And our law, the labor board rejected that concept. They didn't deal with the issue. As I use a sports analogy, they punted on it. They didn't get to the bottom line. So there was a regional director who wanted the Northwestern athletes to be able to try and unionize. The labor board in Washington said, we're not going to consider that. So right now, student athletes are still student athletes. They are not employees of the university. So that's one of the concerns we have with this name, image, and likeness, and how far it goes is whether or not, as I said in the New York bill, we might be making employees out of the student athletes. The one other thing I think is important I want to mention, and I know Rick touched on it, is, we have 1,100 plus members in the NCAA, and I'm not here to be a protector of the NCAA, but I think it's important for everyone to understand the NCAA gets a lot of heat. They tend to be, as people perceive them, as more reactive instead of proactive. And I think all of us would probably agree that to be true. But the challenge for that group is when you have 1,100 members, it's not a handful of people in Indianapolis who are just making these decisions saying, okay, you will now follow our edict. The reality is the 1,100 schools are the ones who are making these decisions. And those decisions take time, and they don't happen overnight. And I think the fact that the NCAA has now embraced this issue, and I know people will say it's not soon enough, it's not quick enough, they're not responding with the speed we need. The fact that the group that Rick is serving on, that working committee, has so quickly come back with suggestions and alternatives, I think is really beneficial. And I'll conclude on one point I think where we're at, and I use for any of us who are old enough to remember, let's make a deal, and there was curtain or door number 1, door number 2, and door number 3. I think door number 1, which I would describe as what I think a few people have mentioned, people having the right as student athletes to pursue certain rights. Maybe it's going to a summer camp as a counselor or a guest speaker. Maybe it's having an opportunity to be a quote-unquote influencer on Instagram and have an opportunity to make some revenue there. I certainly think the NCAA is not going to be opposed to that in the final bylaws and regulations that come down. I think, to use your term, the guardrails, I wasn't going to mention it, but I will mention it. I think the NCAA's concern is we don't want to have a situation where a student athlete, and as Don did a great job of describing the value of an education, is going to be making a college decision as a high school 17 or 18-year-old based upon who is going to guarantee him or have the best, or she's going to have the best opportunity to make money for the name, image, and likeness, instead of going to the school that might fit them best for their students' interest in what they want to essentially lead to in their life. And I think Don's a great example of that, the value of a degree. That at the end of the day is still the NCAA's focus, is to try and help student athletes achieve those goals. And there's such a small number that ever play professionally. I think this name, image, and likeness situation will sort of resolve itself. I think the NCAA is very concerned about, as I said, Zion Williamson, assuming he was still a high school senior, picking a potential school based upon where he's going to get the most money. And then the flip side of protecting that, which we haven't talked about as a former agent, is going to be the input of agents. Now you're going to be opening the door for agents with undergraduates to potentially to negotiate a lot of these contracts. And the most important thing, I think, overall, is just like anything else. we have to have some type of rules in society or laws in society. I think as a group, these 1,100 schools and the student athletes who play for these schools also have to have some rules and some bylaws. Perhaps the 400 pages is a little bit lengthy and overdone, but I do think it's important that there be some rules and bylaws that preserve some of the amateurism that we've all grown up to appreciate.
Okay, that's great. So the format was we were going to have each speaker go for 5 minutes, and as one of the panelists told me, it's pretty easy. 6 times 5 is 30 minutes, and I said I've never seen anybody on one of these panels stay within the prescribed 5 minutes. And every one of you, I wish you would have kept talking because you all had incredibly interesting things to talk about. And so we've got about 40 minutes, 30, 40 minutes to get in some questions. So Dave, you want to lead us off?
Sure. Yeah, Rick, I'll go back to you. And I appreciate all the comments by the panelists, and as you can see, there are a lot of pieces that you're trying to unbundle with this. It is a deep, I'm not going to call it complex, but a deep pool that we jump into. And Greg talked a little bit about name, image, and likeness, and take us back a little bit to name, image, and likeness, and some of the things around that, ways that student athletes could benefit from that going forward, the concepts that begin to be rolled out and talked about.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things, and there's been a lot of discussion about what will be allowed and what won't be allowed moving forward, and there's been a lot of discussion about that, and as I said, this is going to be a process that's going to take some time, but typically I think that the easy things to do are, a student athlete's own work product. It might be a song, it might be a poetry book, it might be an influencer, it might be some of those things that are not necessarily tied to athletics. I think those are things that maybe you can look at and say, okay, let's move forward on, and then as we talk about other areas, we'll look at those. We're in process of doing that as we speak, and we'll have a number of discussions with coaches groups, student athletes, and others to get input. And we won't talk about guidepost, but there has to be guardrails. But there does have to be some regulation there that allows us to have a fair and equitable recruiting process and competition, and so we'll look at all those things, and there will be a lot of legislative things that will come out over the next several months. I think the timeline that the NCAA is on is that, at least from our Board of Governors, is they'd like something done by January of 2021. So, we've got to move a big ship, the NCAA, and our member institutions in a way that allows us to be thoughtful, but we want to do it right, and we've got to think of everything around certain issues, whatever those issues may be.
Is there some low-hanging fruit there? Is there some things that we talk about waivers? We talk about a lot of things that have gone on, and it seems like there's some low-hanging fruit.
Well, there is, and again, it's like I said, it's some of the students' owned work-related product. It may be a family business that they're a part of. I think those things are easy, and I'm sure there's more out there than that. But those are a couple things that you could say, all right, let's legislate them. I know there's certain areas like those that I think there are 200 over the last 5 years. 98% of them were approved by waivers. So why are we doing waivers? Let's legislate it so the student athletes don't have to go through a waiver process to be able to monetize their name, image, and likeness based on their own work product.
Great.
Yeah. So when we had our pregame conference call, I said, wow, everybody sounds like it's on the same page. We need a villain. We need someone who's going to step up and say, hang on a second, this is going to destroy all of college athletics. And Don stepped forward to say, I'm your guy. Except he wants to blow the whole thing up, right? You want to take away, and I said when we were having our discussion, it's so much better, of course, to be in person to have this discussion, and much more fun to be up here talking about it with everybody just waiting to jump in. But what you're really talking about is abolishing what we all, when we dedicate ourselves to a culture of compliance. What we're really talking about is the amateur status of college athletes. So maybe Maddie or Don or anybody that wants to jump in on this, but I'll start with Don, give him a chance at this. are we done with amateurism as we know it in the world today? And why don't we just eliminate that and turn it all into, I think you said, club sports and let everybody make money?
Yeah, and I know that I'm an outlier in that regard. But I also feel that as long as this panel here are people who are concerned with how you monitor the business, regulate the business, as long as we're doing that, throw it out. Just have a football team that gets to use the stadium here at the University of Arizona, and pay the guys as they're worth, whatever the ticket sales are, and do that. Otherwise, throw it out. If they're not going to be a part of the academy, if they're not going to be integrated in what the academy has to offer, then they are. It's as I said earlier, we're going to continue to have this conversation. Who's going to benefit from all this are going to be lawyers and then the people who are taking advantage of kids.
Yep.
That's who's going to benefit from this before we get it right, and either realize that the model doesn't work. Amateurism. I was in a meeting at the NCAA a few years ago. It was the Commission to Combat Campus Sexual Assault, and we were having this conversation, and someone brought up, from the NCAA, a compliance person, brought up extra benefits. The student athletes still, and I said, are we still having the extra benefit conversation?
Yes, we are.
Have you been to this campus? They're not just regular students. They're not. They played on national television in front of hundreds of millions of people, whatever, and they go to class the next day with students. These are not regular students. And as long as we continue to act like they are, and they're not getting extra benefits, of course they're getting extra benefits. There's a ton of extra benefits. I didn't pay for a plane ticket until I was in my late 20s. I went to Syracuse University and came out with zero debt. I didn't understand what college debt meant. That's a benefit. And I know everyone's not on scholarship. I do understand that. But there is a ton that makes them extraneous to the average student experience. Let's stop pretending and give them the opportunity to maximize that experience, as opposed to asking them to act like it doesn't exist. I was stunned when I heard, and I should not be, that extra benefits is still an issue, when there's just millions and millions. I've had Olympic sport coaches say, I've got $1 million budget for my volleyball team on gear. What do I need? And let me just say this. And let me just say this in
Sunscreen for beach volleyball.
Right, and that's why the budgets are skewed. And I just say this because I want to say this in the point of purity, and then you can tell me to shut up because I don't want to take up all the air in the room. 2 weeks ago, I was part of a group that hosted the Cortica Cup at MetLife Stadium, which is formerly, for those of you who don't know, New York, New Jersey, is where the Giants and the Jets play. And we had Cortland State and Ithaca play in front of 45,000 fans. It was the best thing happening in college football that day. None of those guys are going pro. And I got a chance to talk to both teams the night before the game, and what I told them was that the team that's going to maximize this experience is the one's going to realize that all this stuff, the lights, the stadium, New York City, the backdrop, all the things that the people around you are doing to make this is about them and not about you. What's about you is the guy next to you and the guy in front of you. So if you ask me about the purity of sport and what drives the passion, everything I said earlier, what drives our passion, what drives our loyalty, what drives the reason why we love the game, that's it. And as soon as you throw that out for all the lights and glitter, you've lost it all.
All right. So,
Sure.
Maddie?
Well, I mean, to address amateurism, number one, I
did
think
that better than I
the best definition that I've ever read about amateurism, because there isn't one, was in the plaintiff's brief, their closing argument reply brief in Alston v. NCAA. And it said the concept of amateurism is a chameleon-like principle that constantly changes with the means. And that's 100% true. Our definition of amateurism started as, athletes can't be compensated for anything. Now it involves some sports being compensated, and it's different even across divisions, what actually being an amateur athlete means, and whether you're eligible or not. And even on the NCAA's website, they have, and I did a video on this 11 months ago. It's interesting because it's actually changed from what it said on the website even then. but it includes a list of things that might render an athlete ineligible. It doesn't say, what specifically amateurism is, what an amateur athlete is or does. You have tennis athletes who can make $10,000 while, a soccer player can not make anything for tournaments or what have you. And we're so focused on this notion that, if athletes are able to just make money, let's move sports aside. Athletes are barred from just using their body of work, which includes their image as an athlete and all the things that they worked hard for, to promote a business, to do anything that they want to, bring some money on the side. College athletics, as we all know, is a job. I mean, it is a tremendous sacrifice. Yes, there are some incredible benefits and opportunities that come with it, but it comes at a cost, and it comes at a cost to your body. I mean, I'm a person I was injured. I had 3 knee surgeries over the course of my college career. My body was shot by the time I graduated. I sacrificed that all, and I loved the game just as much as anyone else, but it comes at a cost, and I think so often we forget about all of the opportunities that athletes have to pass up, whether it's a class or a lecture that they could attend on campus or an internship that they could do or going abroad during the season. These are things that, yes, athletes make those decisions when they enter college, but it is a cost, and they're working a full-time job. They're every second of their day pretty much is controlled by their coaches, especially when they're on the road. And, over the course of time, especially with social media, now you have universities leveraging their student athletes to, make money, and more and more conferences are developing apps and that contain profiles of athletes that are interactive, that fans can. It's all to bring in money to the university, some of which goes to athletes, but a lot of which goes to the millions of dollars in salaries for coaches. It goes to fancy facilities that really are above and beyond probably what athletes need, and only are used by certain teams in many cases. A lot of the facilities are touted as these buildings that all athletes will use, but you go onto a lot of campuses and it's one sport. It's a lot of times football or basketball has access to these facilities. And, talking about traveling, the way that a basketball team travels is very different than the way that a lacrosse team travels, and that's just the bottom line. And the benefits that come even to staff members of these teams are very different across sports. So what is amateurism? I really don't know. I think it's this notion that, you're a student in college and that there's some educational experience. But if that's really what college athletics is about, then we need to go back in that direction, perhaps, and actually allow athletes to be able to take full advantage of all of the things that their university offers. Not just during a certain practice time that they can, sometimes, attend classes and miss practice sometimes. I mean, if it really is about the educational experience, but that's not what happens. And, when you're talking about TV schedules that dictate when a game will be, and it's, 8, 9 o'clock at night, or you have athletes who are at tournaments for weeks on end, barely, traveling in the middle of the night, how are they supposed to actually be students? And no, the athletes these days are celebrities on campus. I mean, they go into class and they're not mingling with the rest of the student body. They may have friends who are athletes, and there may be a few people that they associate with, but they are isolated. They can't just hang out after class. They're usually rushing to practice right after, or getting some sleep because they're exhausted. And that's the reality of sports now. And I think it has changed. It's changed even over the last 5 years, and a lot of that is just it's technology, it's social media, and it's only going to continue to change with things that we can't even predict right now. And so for college athletics to exist in the form that it is, it's not sustainable.
Yeah, so good. I know some people want to jump in, so just jump in. But we talk about how this is going to take a long time, and it's going to be. Who knew healthcare was so complicated, right? Who knew this would be so complicated? The fundamental thing is you're going to, in order to be able to implement this, you're going to have to just say it's all or none, because this slow, stepwise progression of what happens, when the 14-year-old comes to campus and got a shoe contract. They can't. They violated their amateurism status, so they can't come to college.
That's correct.
Oh, no, they can come to college, they just can't
Can't
get.
They can't play in their
Yeah.
sport.
Yeah.
Right. You'll understand that.
Then that shoe contract's not worth very much.
Well, or they could come play for the HBL where you don't have to sacrifice. I think the
Or they
the
could
Right,
be
and I do think
Olympians.
student athletes have the ability to do that out of high school. If they want to go pro in a lot of sports, they can. Let them go.
They can, but so here's the thing. First of all, when you take all of the primary demand for talent and you all agree collectively we're not going to pay them, to then say, why don't you go to Europe, is a false choice. It is exactly the same as saying we're going to price fix all the TVs. If you want to buy one, take a boat to Europe and bring your TV home with you. That's a violation of the antitrust laws. The NCAA has now been found 3 times to have violated the NCAA rules. Once when they tried to price fix coaches' salaries, and twice in O'Bannon for NIL, and then in Alston Jenkins for the amount of benefits just generally that are offered. I feel like I completely agree with Don that if you let an athlete into the wrong school and you take advantage of his athletic skills and don't provide him with an education, it's exploitative. But I don't understand at all why them being able to do a commercial in the summer somehow lessens the education. Emma Watson went to Brown and got a degree and made Harry Potter movies in the summer, and no one felt that she was like not a real Brown student.
Exactly.
And so it's like between the two of you, it's like yes, education, but like no collusion. And
But you don't have to pick between doing the Harry Potter movies and what school to go to.
well, right.
To go to wherever she wanted to go to school, and then she also.
But
did
there are
Harry Potter.
353 schools that play D1 basketball. There's a lot of choice.
Yes.
And if you don't want to play at that level, there's hundreds of schools. There's 3,200 accredited universities in the United States.
Correct.
So this idea, like the Cornell, was it Ithaca against Cortland?
Cortland State, yes, sir.
Cortland State, like that, nothing that we're talking about is going to affect that because consumer demand for that game is low, and so the market value and the actual value received are about the same. And so, like, we don't need to toss that out to change the way the market reacts where there is consumer demand. And I just don't think that responding to consumer demand by athletes, Colorado pays its basketball coach less than Arizona does, and thinks Arizona thinks that's an advantage because Sean Miller is better at getting athletes, and it helps them win. We don't have a problem with that because, and when we did try to price fix the coaches, the court said you can't do that. And so this idea that like competition is like this evil Pandora's box, but the only thing we slammed it down on is hope for the athletes, who are the only people who aren't allowed to get this. The world of competitive balance would be exactly the same. Here, in 1956, Simon Rottenberg, University of Chicago, wrote a paper about baseball, and he said, and that's the first sports economics paper, we're 60, 70, I can't even add, years later, showed that whether or not you have...
I was born in 57. Don't make me
All right,
that old now.
whether or not you have free agency in baseball will not affect negatively competitive balance. And when you didn't have free agency in baseball, the Yankees were in the World Series every year. And now that you have competitive free agency, there's better competitive balance. The single biggest impediment to competitive balance in sports right now is that Kentucky doesn't have to pay market rate to stock the roster with NBA players. If they had to pay market rate, they couldn't afford them all, and they would be spread out more. So I just feel like this idea that somehow capitalism that we all seem to like every place else, like if we want to live in a socialist paradise, that's fine with me. But until the coaches are living in that paradise, I just don't understand why we don't grant athletes market access.
Okay, let's don't lose this momentum because I think it got us going down a positive place here. So what's the solution? It's like we all agree everybody needs access to health care. We're behind everybody else in the whole world.
Well,
we're the only industrialized country and developed country.
Healthcare is harder because the people who consume the product don't pay for it.
No, I understand that. I'm trying to use it as an analogy of, okay, we've agreed that we want to compensate.
So just do it.
So just do it.
Just do it, literally. So what's the
how-
problem?
what
Okay,
is-
well,
That's what we're in process of
No,
doing.
but literally just do it. Don't make rules. So like,
Don't make rules.
Don't
How are you
make
gonna have things
rules.
without rules?
we have
Come on.
laws. We have contracts. We have...
So we have contract law that governs certain things, or if they want to hire an agent to help them, then that agent is most likely, knock on wood, they should be
They'll have a fiduciary duty.
already licensed in whatever jurisdiction that they're practicing in, much like us attorneys are, and we are allowed to.
And what are you going to do if the agent's not licensed and he comes and destroys the amateur status of your
Put him in jail.
It's not allowed to.
Put him in jail.
If
How many
if
agents have
you have an
gone to jail?
unlicensed, if you have an agent who is violating his fiduciary duty, what do you do in the pros when
Well,
that happens?
with these laws that are being
They're
written
not
right
longer
now.
certified.
Right, what?
They lose their certifications.
They're
Well, with
Okay,
many
so
of
that's
these
something the
laws-
NCAA could do. They could have a certification program.
They're trying to do that, and that's being
They're
fought
trying
by
to
the
do that in
agents.
North
It's
Carolina.
being fought
So-
by the agents,
right.
that's correct.
Okay, but so, like,
But that's only for men's
so
basketball.
why,
It's always good when we get
getting
everybody
live.
talking at the same time.
We're getting live.
This is
but
good
why,
TV.
but why is that, okay, we can't do it then? Whereas, like, it seems like the agents don't like it, so we're not gonna pursue that action. Let me just play this out. If we had just a market, I know someone's gonna say, well, but what if a car dealer in Tuscaloosa pays a football player more than he's really worth to do an ad for football, and then they might get Tua Tagovailoa to go to Alabama, like they already did. And like, you know, there's a reason why Clemson and Alabama, I know Alabama is only going to like finish 8th this year, but like there's a reason why those schools consistently win is because when you pay everyone the same amount, the best currency you can give is winning. And is access to the next level. And so the whole idea that somehow, like literally you cannot go through the sports economics literature and find any evidence that better, more competitive pay hurts competitive balance. I know all the leagues say it, but what the conclusions are is that it lowers athlete pay, it doesn't improve competitive balance.
Right, and I think also, you know, one of the things that keeps getting mentioned is that we're concerned about athletes unfairly using, you know, name, image, and likeness to recruit athletes. Well, number one, there are all sorts of promises that are made by coaches now. I mean, whether it's playing time or, you know, we're going to put you here, like, we're going to make you a celebrity on campus. Those things are being said. There are also, you know, so athletes are already making a choice, in some cases, to go to a place where they're getting actually less in scholarship money, which is a form of payment, if we're going to talk about it in terms of that. So athletes are turning down larger scholarship offers now to go to a school that either offers, you know, their major or whatever prestige that they want, or, like Andy said, a winning team. And people make those decisions all the time. So you open up name, image, and likeness, that doesn't in and of itself create this, you know, recruiting disadvantage. But let's look, you know, in all honesty, what's going on now, I mean, the rules in the NCAA have been geared towards competitive balance since the dawn of time. I mean, I think we all remember the, you know, bagel and peanut butter rule, which was real, and that was really proposed by a school because they were concerned that another school might be able to get, you know, have, I don't know what they thought their athletes were going to be able to do on peanut butter, but somehow that was going to be a competitive advantage. Well, I mean, but these were real discussions that were happening, and they're still continuing to happen, and it's extending into name, image, and likeness. But you know, I don't think we're taking a real look at what's going on now. We're you know, saying all these things are going to happen in the future, but right now there are recruiting violations all over the place. But
And that's the
coaches
problem,
do
though.
things
It's
that, I
gonna
mean,
exacerbate.
it's just well known that
You
things
wouldn't
are
have
happening
something
that are
called the
not
Power 5 schools if there was competitive balance.
which was created behind closed doors of the NCAA at the 2014 convention after it was, you know, assured that the Power 5 conferences were not going to split off into their own football conference. So they roll out this deal where now the Power 5s have more weighted voting than any other conference, and they can basically control most of the rules in the NCAA. So you want to talk about also, you know, athletes in that process. Athletes have, I think, you know, 3% of the total vote in the NCAA voting process. All of those things are a problem, and that's what's going on now. So.
But what risk does a student athlete take if Dave Hickey is the athletic director of the University of Arizona? If all of a sudden no one shows up for a basketball game or a football game for whatever reason, as attendance is going down in most of these venues around the country, that scholarship value is not going down. The university still has an obligation to fulfill that scholarship obligation. So they're not taking the risk. The universities are taking the risk by giving the student athletes the scholarship with unlimited potential, as Don talked about, of utilizing that degree in the future. I think the problem is to go all the way and have just unlimited name, image, and likeness rights right out of the box, as opposed to doing it, let's start with one level. Let's see how that goes. Let's see how if we're successful with that, and then monitor that so we don't get in a position where, yeah, coaches make promises, which is part of the recruiting process.
Schools do too.
Schools do too. But how many student athletes right now, and you might disagree with me, are saying, I'm going to XYZ college because I know I can get a $250,000 endorsement by Nike if I go there.
Well, they're not doing that at all because they're not allowed.
Correct. So we
Well,
want to
but-
open
But-
that Pandora's box and having student athletes make a college selection based upon
Well,
where
if
they
I'm
believe
saying
they
I
can
don't
maximize
necessarily
their
think
value.
that that's going to happen either. And I think,
Why do you think it's not going to happen? I don't mean to interrupt you, but why do you think that
this
won't
one's
happen?
going to, well,
That a student athlete wouldn't say, hey, they're a Nike school versus an Under Armour school versus an Adidas school.
I don't
this
think
is
this
based
that
on
would happen by
market
6
demand, but
o'clock.
you said it yourself. You said it yourself.
Immediately.
Schools still have the rights to their trademarks and all sorts
Yes.
of other licensing, so they're not getting cut out of the deal by allowing athletes to profit off of their name, image, and likeness. So it's up to athletes to contract, and yeah, we can make rules around, I think the California bill does it pretty well, where you can't, sign a contract that is in direct conflict with a school sponsor. But, that's for the companies themselves to work out too. It's not, I think we're looking at it very linearly to say that by opening up name, image, and likeness rights, it by default, takes away all money that schools are making. And,
No, I'm not saying
yeah,
that. I'm just saying that, as I started with, the schools take the risk. The student athletes have the
They
guaranteed
take some risk,
scholarship.
but
Oh,
athletes'
look at
athletes
this.
their
But-
bodies
follower.
at risk every day, so they're taking a huge risk too. Coming to college for someone who is considering going pro means putting at risk your body. You could get injured so badly that you never play.
Very
And
true.
right now, the term student athlete has prevented the NCAA from compensating athletes who have been injured while playing and sustain lifelong injuries. And that is one of the things that directly is being blocked right now. So there are a lot of issues, within this world that really need to be changed. I mean, it's a problem.
There are a lot of issues, and as to, just a couple of quick notes, as to the universities taking risks about people not attending games, they didn't have to get in the arms race for these massive stadiums to beat each other one by one either necessarily, but they thought that it would help them recruit athletes and stuff as is. And then a second note, what was my
Well, one thing I'd say to that, our stadium was built 90 years ago. So, it's the same
Probably paid-
facility that was built 90 years ago than today. So I think what we're talking about is a little bit different. We're talking about building facilities that are benefiting our staffs, our student athletes, and future student athletes. And I think that's important because I think you can correlate it to success. And the other thing that I'll say, and we talk about this, is that the graduation rate of student athletes is higher than the general student body almost every campus. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason because the universities are providing opportunities and they're creating cultures where academics are important, and they do have a meaningful degree when they leave their institution.
Well, I think partly it's also because of the transfer rules that make it so difficult for athletes to transfer and leave. And
No,
that is
but that's
a
been-
factor.
But that's been true of student athletes, and
That's not-
women student athletes graduate at a higher rate. I mean, there's just, because they do take advantage of the resources that are available, and athletes do better in season than they do out of season. I mean, all those things that fly against conventional wisdom, it's because when they're in season, they're more disciplined with their time. And so there's a lot of ways in which what's currently there is doing, I'm sitting here I'm still stuck in the Hermione analogy that when you bring up Emma Thompson, is it Emma
Emma,
Thompson?
yeah, as opposed to Deshaun. Emma Watson.
Emma Watson, excuse me, Emma Watson. I know her as Hermione,
Yes.
right? There are no Hermiones in college athletics. There are no people who are at that level of control of the massive amount of opportunity to expand their experience.
I think that's because at age 18, they're thwarted.
No, I know. I think it's because they're playing a sport that is confined to a system that is a league. This is a league. And the NCAA and the Pac-12 is a league that organizes games for student, and I use student athletes, to compete against one another. And in that league, you need structure. And I just want to, when I say that there's no one like this, and why I'm a little stuck is that, when you start talking about having an agent to decipher a shoe deal, and I talk to a lot of single parents, a lot of single moms who have sons who are trying to figure out where to go to school. It's a complicated process. And I tell people all the time in the recruiting process, there's no such thing as the best school. It's the right school for you. And that takes a lot of due diligence for a young person, male or female, any kind of sport, any division, to figure out this is where I'm going to spend the next. So that for most students, they go to higher education and their worlds go this way. For student athletes, it goes the other way around. Where we start focus, you get so focused on your sport, where you're there so many hours, it becomes your job, it becomes and that process of finding that place that's gonna allow you to do this is so difficult enough that you layer on, and that's why I refer to this as a third market. You're already in a market. You're already in a marketplace that is producing and is involved with a tremendous amount of resources. You're already in a market that's there to help you expand your life through education, through the scholarly pursuit of knowledge, and to layer on this other burden on parents to decipher agents and deals on monetizing outside of that endeavor, you're asking a lot of people who really don't. When the clearinghouse was introduced, parents had no idea how to help their kids just get qualified.
I think they still don't.
They still don't.
The NCAA rules are complicated too.
It is a tough process.
Okay,
and,
it's like that.
And so let me just make this one last point.
You're right about that.
You're not talking about athletes who may go into free agency and say, you know what, I'm going to spend 5 years in this city and 3 years in this city. They've got, maybe if you're lucky as a student athlete, you've got 2 or 3 years of good competitive life in you.
Yep.
That they have to figure out to do that and get a degree. Layering in this whole concept of asking them to go into a third market to monetize their experience is far-fetched that it's going to happen in any way that benefits the individual student athlete.
I'm still struggling for the analogy. Our producers are telling us in their ear, we don't really have any producers. But we got to end this. Sadly, I know why you all came so far for just this short amount of time, because I don't know how many of you know each other and do this all the time, but this has been such a rich discussion. But I'm going to ask that each person take like a minute and we kind of focus in on, well, what's the solution? What's the system in your mind? I had another analogy I was going to blurt out, but now I'm forgetting. I should have written it down. It wasn't a healthcare one, but it was. It's about what does the system look like to you going forward? Because we're great at talking about all the what ifs, but if you were in charge and you had the perfect system, would it be just pay the students to, they could make money and be students at the same time? Because there were a couple of references thrown out about, movie stars, and I understand there's a celebrity chef who's a student, a YouTube celebrity chef at Stanford who's a student. She makes lots of money, and influencers, and so why not just, there is no rule, right? Oh, I know what I was going to say. Kevin McCarthy, the guy that in the House of Representatives from the Houston area, he would always talk about, he had this 3x5 card he would pull out of his pocket. Look at this tax code. It's 3 or 4 different layers of this thing. It's so complicated, nobody can understand, of course, except the lawyers and the economists. And he said, I'm going to reduce the tax code to a 3x5 card. It's going to make it so easy, everybody can understand it. So how do we take the 400 pages of stuff and reduce it to the 3x5 card to make it where even I can understand it and it'll be fair and equitable? So Greg, why don't you start us off, and Maddie will just come this way, and if we go over, Ricardo, we go over.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for offering their varying opinions, and I think the one thing that you just said, President Robbins, which is very important, is that this is a work in progress. And I think, as several people have hinted at, no one's going to be really happy and satisfied, because it's some way in between of my door 1 and door 3 is where it's going to end up. And I think we're more likely to see a door 1 as the initial phasing and see how that goes. I think ultimately, as I've talked about all these various states that are proposing legislation, or California that already has legislation, I think it's going to end up being a federal issue. And we have a congressman already out of North Carolina. We have a former NCAA player who played in the NFL, who's a congressman out of Ohio, who has talked about introducing federal legislation. Because one of the nightmarish things from the NCAA's perspective is if all 27 or 28 states, as of now, have that legislation get passed, I think it'll be literally impossible. We talk about bylaws now that are 400 pages. We're going to have bylaws that are 600 pages, because we're going to have the varying exceptions for each state, and the internal competition of having, for example, a University of Arizona to compete against multiple schools in the state of California without having the benefit of having name, image, and likeness rights from a recruiting perspective is going to create a really uneven playing field. And I know that's one of the things the NCAA and Rick and your committee are working so hard on, is to make sure we have a level playing field. So I think the ultimate solution, to answer your question, President Robbins, is going to be federal legislation in order to eliminate these hills and valleys of the different state legislations.
Yeah, so we hear that Senator Romney from the Republican side and Representative Gonzalez, they're
Correct.
trying to work together to get bipartisan legislation, and I think that's going to have, it's going to have to be a national solution. Maddie?
I think, what do we do with the system? I think you eliminate most of the rules. Get rid of the transfer rules, get rid of the rules against name, image, and likeness, and focus on the actual health and safety of players, which is what the NCAA was created to protect, and it's not doing. I mean, there is rampant abuse that goes on within athletics, and athletes have really very few avenues to get help. I think what they need is actual access to people who have solely their best interests at heart, that aren't employees of the university with, other agendas sometimes, or people who can't really help to give them advice on all sorts of things, like transferring universities if they're at a school that is, no longer something that is a good fit for them, whether they're, unhappy there, whether it's related to being bullied or abused by their coaches, that, can help put them in a better situation. And I think those issues alone are just so often overlooked, and athletes just aren't taken seriously, or even when they will bring cases forward, aren't helped, and things are just kept under wraps by universities because they're more concerned about their reputation and the effect that it might have on donors, that they're not really looking out for the interests of their athletes. I think things like playing in practice. Let's really look. If you want to say that athletes aren't employees of the university, then don't have them work 40+ hours a week. And enough with the what is the word? The
Fake voluntary.
No, yeah, well, the fake voluntary, but I'm talking about the other side of that. Get rid of those. Just say you cannot spend more than X amount of time doing anything related to your sport, whether it's voluntary or not, and you actually will restore some balance to the athletes where they can actually be students, and they're not spending all their time in the training room or on the field, or watching film, going to pressers. I mean, there are so many things that the athletes spend their time doing. So I think all of those things, make it a world where we actually care about athletes more than we do about the advertising and donors.
But even in the professional leagues, there are collective bargaining agreements, and you can't spend more than a certain number of hours in practice, and on and on and on. So I think there does need to be some rules around the process. But Don, where would you take us?
I think if you look at the bankruptcy rate of professional athletes and the whole host of problems that they have that lead to those issues, and that number is alarming, that we haven't done a good enough job of educating those young men of how to deal with that. And if we haven't done that job with men who are in their 20s and have had the benefit in most sports, and I am not talking obviously about Olympic sports, and I am talking about football and basketball primarily, because that's what's driving this conversation, whether we want to admit that or not. Then we failed those men because we didn't teach them how to organize and maintain their financial lives in the midst of financial bonanza. And I'm not going to tell you how old I am and what I got paid in the NFL as opposed to what's being paid now, that these men are still having trouble financially. We have not taught them how to manage it. And so if we're going to introduce this concept, and I say again, of forcing student athletes because we don't want to include them in the business that they're driving and ask them to go to another market where they can benefit on their name, image, and likeness. If we don't attach financial literacy to that conversation, we are just setting them up for failure earlier.
Great point.
And so if education and financial literacy is not, as it says in the NCAA document, tethered to this, once again, I get exasperated by where we are in this conversation, because you're going to see the financial carnage of young men and women, because now we're going to include women in that equation of trying to monetize. We're going to see that at an early age, and ruining their lives on a much longer projection, because they may not be professional athletes that can fall back on millions of dollars.
So if I can answer it two different ways, as an entrepreneur, I am really thrilled at how slow the NCAA is moving. That it's going to take forever, it's going to be limited. It's bad for America, but it's good for the HBL because we have an online program that's being developed now on financial literacy. We think the best way to prevent professional athlete bankruptcies is to have them learning how to use money in small doses earlier, that the very process of figuring out, oh gosh, how do I do in college? So that's one thing. But if I can turn, I've been trying to reform the NCAA before this entrepreneurial thing for 20 years. And in 1999, I wrote a paper with a colleague, Dan Rasher, at University of San Francisco, where we said that the simplest way to solve the problem is to end NCAA limits on anything and instead say to each conference, pick a limit. Most of the games that you play each season are against your conference mates. If you want to be a D3 level conference, be a D3 level conference. If you want to be an open conference where the sky's the limit, be an open, and essentially your fan base, your alumni, your consumers will say, yeah, we're the Big Ten, we've always liked to be pure, we don't want to pay SEC prices for football players. And then the consequence is, like, we're adults, you might get less good football players. And you might win the Big Ten championship and then get destroyed in the playoffs. And the SEC might be like, let's bring all the bag money over on top of the table. That would be okay, because essentially each conference is a league. The NCAA is not a league. The NCAA is a sanctioning body and a wage cartel. And you could solve that problem, but please don't, because I have a lot of investors that have banked on the idea that we have at least 5 years before the NCAA gets it right, where we can hire the 100 best basketball players each year in college, pay for their educations, help them learn how to commercialize their likeness, and not only that, but pick a school in their city that is independent in some sense of where they want to play basketball so that they don't have to make those compromises. Yeah. So I'm here, I'm telling you how to fix it, but don't.
Yeah, but you're focused on basketball.
Yeah, I mean,
100 top players in basketball.
We'll move to other sports. The problem with football is that as a commercial enterprise, you're causing brain damage to your labor force, and so we can't get
No,
it.
you're
Sure.
not.
That's not accurate.
No, you're not.
No, you're not.
I'm sitting right next
That
to you.
is
I just
not
wrote
a-
a f***ing book.
Okay, wait.
Brain
I'm
damage.
the same.
No,
Okay.
I'm tired
But
of this.
asbestos
No,
doesn't
that's
give everyone
not accurate.
cancer.
Argument. I'm tired of this argument
Are you
that
saying that
football-
cigarettes don't cause cancer because some people don't get cancer?
You're saying,
you didn't get brain
just said-
damage.
you just said that football causes brain damage.
I did, and it's
That is the
true.
most ridiculous
It
statement
doesn't
I've
cause
ever
brain
heard.
damage to everyone.
Cause brain damage, but a lot of
Falling into ice can cause hypothermia, and it might not.
Falling on a skateboard has brain damage too.
We were going
Yes,
so
but what I'm
well.
saying-
we were coming
what-
down the
what
home
I'm saying
stretch.
is-
That is-
Seen that thing
that
on
is
on
I'm sorry.
But that's why.
SVP where
but we
you know we're explaining. He said, "What could happen wrong?" And the guy falls off the horse. And nothing could happen wrong here. Blooper.
So,
Yeah.
so
Yes,
all right,
all right.
let me put it. Football has caused and continues to cause brain damage in many people. And so as a business enterprise, it is in the long-term doom. But
Name the people.
well,
people.
And name the evidence. And name the evidence
Many
of their
people.
brain damage.
Junior Seau.
Name the evidence of his brain damage.
He had CTA. They did a brain autopsy.
After you,
After he shot himself because he went crazy.
well, that's your assessment.
Okay.
That's
and-
but hang on a second. No. And here's, you know what? You talked about my book. The reason for my book, the subtitle of my book is The Blind Spot of Masculinity.
Yes.
And part of the blind spot is this attitude, and it's the attitude that's rooted in this conversation, that Junior Seau is nothing more than a football player. And all he was taught to be was a warrior. And all anyone wanted him to be was a warrior. Anyone cared about him
just
was a
want him to
warrior.
be
Hang on a
alive.
second. Anyone cared about him was to be a warrior. Ignore your pain, ignore your feeling, run through the wall. And that's what he adopted. I've got 33 guys who are dead who played the game of football, and it wasn't brain damage. You know what it was? Their inability to say, I'm struggling, I'm hurting, I don't know how to do this. I'm not the warrior that everyone thinks I am.
And did football cause that?
No.
What did?
The culture of masculinity.
I'm masculine.
the
I don't
culture-
have that. Well, I guess it doesn't cause it.
The culture of masculinity, the culture that wants these guys to be warriors and to ignore who they are.
Okay,
And that's what, by
okay,
the way, that's what this conversation is about. Monetize because you're worth something, not as a human being, but as a commodity.
Except, okay.
Okay, let's
I don't want
let's
to
move on.
monopolize.
go ahead.
Got really intense.
Yeah.
So coming back, throughout the history of the collegiate model, there have been two factors that have defined amateurism that have been constant. It's that the payers are not paid salaries and that they attend member institutions. So if you peel back some of these unnecessary regulations, and if the NCAA were to take those resources on saying, where they would monitor the money that these college athletes would be making on the side, if they took away those resources and use those resources and put them into the educational aspects, providing them some financial education and giving them a little bit more so that way they are able to take advantage of that and not worry about, oh my gosh, am I breaking a rule? I think that would be the ideal situation. And with these NIL rights specifically, unfortunately, the NCAA wasn't able to be as proactive a decade ago on this when the discussion was really starting to rev up. And that would be the ideal situation because we're comfortable with them being the governing body on this. This piecemeal state-by-state stuff, I'll take it. It's better than nothing. But it would be more ideal if we had one uniform thing, such as a federal legislation, as regarding the amount of regulation that would need to be done through this legislation. I would say just let them have it, but not everyone's not as much of a believer in the free market as me. So in order to appease some of the parties, one thing I did see in the California law that I think works for both parties is that if a college athlete enters into a contract with NIL rights, they have to report it to the university. And that way, if we do that route, it's not my preferred one, but it's something that's realistic, at least that way the NCAA would be able to, and the member institutions would be able to start really gathering real-world information on the types of contracts, the size of the contracts, the male-female ratio, revenue, non-revenue sports, comparing different markets. And that's kind of how I think it's going to roll in the short term. In the long term, I think we'll see it in a more unregulated fashion.
Rick, tell us what it's really going to be.
So I'll just tell you that I'll do this in 1 minute or less, like you said.
Nobody else said, so you can go right ahead.
The only thing I'll say is the collegiate model has worked historically, and it's worked very well for a number of years. The benefits that we provide student athletes today are significant. And the name, image, and likeness, that was the real question that we were supposed to answer. What does that look like? Right now what it looks like is that we're going to provide another opportunity for our student athletes. Whatever it is, it's not going to satisfy some people, but at the end of the day, it's going to be what we believe is the best opportunity for our student athletes moving forward.
All right.
Dave, give you the final word.
Well, I guess I'll try to close it out, but I want to thank everyone for being here today and being part of this. Certainly thank our panelists for the robust conversation. We've got a ways to go, but it's been great to be here today, to be a leader in the conversation and really take part in this so we can move down that road. The college model is changing to a degree. How do we all want it to change is under a lot of discussion. There's great benefits, there's great opportunities for young student athletes on a lot of different levels. And, I think that we're headed down that road to the name, image, and likeness. And we're headed toward more deregulation of that. And then the story will be written to see where we go from there. So thanks everyone for being here. We really appreciate it. It's been a great deal.